Good evening. I'm Eric Ward, Vice President of Programs and Education here at the Linda Hall Library. Thank you for joining us this evening for Humans, a Monstrous History with Dr. Surekha Davies. Blending science, history, and pop culture, Dr. Davis tells the strange and compelling story of how our multi-millennial relationship with monsters has shaped the origins of the modern world. Dr. Davis is a British historian of science, speaker, historical monster consultant, and author. Her most recent book is the subject of tonight's talk, Humans, a Monstrous History, published by the University of California Press earlier this year. Her first book, Renaissance Ethnography and the Invention of the Human, won the Morris D. Forkosh Prize for the best first book in intellectual history from the Journal of the History of Ideas and the Roland H. Bainton Prize in History and Theology. She has published essays and book reviews about the histories of biology, anthropology, and monsters in the Los Angeles Times, the Times Literary Supplement, Nature, Science, and Eon. But perhaps most notably, Dr. Davis was a recent Linda Hall Library Research Fellow. So it's great to have welcome Dr. Davis back. Good morning. It's a very early good morning, right?
It is indeed. Thank you very much from 2 a.m. land, but I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, looking forward to your presentation.
Thank you so much. Well, let's begin. You should now see a PowerPoint screen.
Yep, it looks great.
Thank you. For many people, monsters are the stuff of fiction and trivia, relegated to the spooky corners of the bookcase. But in fact, any classificatory system with discrete categories contains monsters, category breakers that lie between or across categories. Monsters may seem like the opposite of humans, but in fact they exist on a continuum with us. Societies invent positive, negative, and neutral monsters to define three types of boundaries. One type lies between human and other stuff, animals, gods, machines, Martians. The second type are boundaries between social groups, and they define and police ideas about race, nation, sex, and gender. The third type of boundary invents the parameters of normal for an individual through concepts like freak, genius, or prodigy. Human has never been an unchanging or universal category. It's always defined in relation to other things, from animals to space aliens. Stories about monsters are what keep categories separate from one another. Humans: A Monstrous History explores how and why humans define themselves by defining beings and people as monsters. Ancient gods, Star Trek cyborgs, Muppets, and in the real world, in various places, at various moments, categories of real people, from immigrants to reigning queens. But in whose eyes are any of them monsters? And what were the consequences of framing them as thus, of monstrification? And is there an alternative? Monster making is the act of telling stories about who counts as fully human and what counts as normal, and who gets cast as the monsters of the body politic. Humanity's long history of defining monsters still shapes the present. Today's acts of monstrification draw the horizons of possibility for recognizing the human in the future. There are no monsters, yet all of them are real, and the boundaries between human and monster are more porous than you might think. Urgent questions about human and civil rights, labor, wealth, health, technology, and climate justice rest on a foundation of monsters. Monster making shapes and reveals how people think about science, society, and humanity. We can't fully understand the present or avoid making the same mistakes in the future without attending to the long history of monsters. As I'll show in this talk, This is not a history of monsters, but a history through monsters. Let me now take you on a time-traveling tour of monsters, from antiquity to the present and from Earth to outer space. In ancient Greece and Rome, philosophers and naturalists interpreted one-off atypical births as a message or punishment from the gods or as accidents or jokes of nature. They defined monstrous peoples, entire nations who supposedly shared an unusual trait, like having their faces in their, chests or possessing an enormous upper lip. And you see some examples of what they called monstrous peoples here. Three features set monstrous individuals apart from one-off monstrous, from three features set one-off monstrous individuals apart from monstrous peoples or nations. Monstrous peoples supposedly lived far from the temperate climate of Europe. Their strange features were widespread across their communities, and they passed these features down to their children. So what caused them? Ancient Greek, Roman, and other Mediterranean and Near Eastern thinkers understood human to be entangled with the world beyond their skin. Local ecology shaped bodies, health, and temperaments, what we might today call personalities. It affected the four essential substances called humors that made up their bodies: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. Before the modern age, European physicians' knowledge of the human body was underpinned by this theory of bodily humors. For the ancients, human difference was environmental, social, and malleable. As you see on these kind of medieval maps, drawing on those same traditions, the edges of the earth was where the climate was most extreme, and these were the places that contained monsters. So the extreme north and south and the equator. For Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, a key monster-making zone lay around the equator, where, as he put it, India and parts of Ethiopia especially teem with marvels. Traces of this thinking survives on medieval maps. From the 13th to the 15th centuries, mapmakers located monstrous peoples as far away as possible from Jerusalem, the spiritual center of the Christian universe. There you have the earthly paradise. On the left there, you can see the wall behind which Alexander the Great apparently, built a wall to keep the tribes of Gog and Magog away. East is at the top of this map. And there on the southern rim are monstrous peoples. Let's look at them in a bit more detail. You have here beings like troglodytes who were bent over and lived in caves, anthropophagi who ate human flesh, blemmies with faces in their heads, even faces in their chests, dog heads, and a skiapod, a person with a giant foot held above their head like a sunshade. For Pliny, monstrous peoples at the edges of the world were still people, at once something else, yet essentially similar in kind to humanity in ways that, say, a cat, a horse, or even a monkey were not. But that was the problem. Humans weren't fixed in stone or in flesh. Since bodies were malleable, there was a slippery slope from the self to the monster and even to the animal. This alarming possibility shaped European ideas about race and nation in the 15th and 16th centuries, once their ships sailing under, European flags undertook oceanic travel, sewing together the formerly distinct worlds of self and monster. Around 1500, European tools for explaining human variety began to break down. European exploration of the Americas posed the problem of how to reconcile information from westward voyages with ancient ideas about distant places. World maps that used latitude and longitude coordinates made geographical relationships between people visible in a new way. Viewers could compare at a glance different people in various latitudes. And here are some details from the far north. This is especially visible on Sancho Gutierrez's world map of 1551 that you see here. Ancient writings about ecology prompted 16th century readers of travel writing about distant places to draw connections between the region's location, climate, foodstuffs, and inhabitants. But the theory that people were malleable raised problems. If people moved from one region to another, theoretically their physical and mental characteristics would eventually change. Where then was the boundary between regular people and monstrous peoples, between human space and monster space? There were consequences for colonialism and empire. Newly found peoples might turn out to lack the mental capacities for understanding Christianity or civilized life. European Christians or their offspring might degenerate if they spent too long in the wrong environment. One had to observe bodies and behaviors to extrapolate how the climate might have shaped a culture's mental capacities. Human variety on a map made visual claims about how different climates acted on bodies over time. And they implied that colonialism had to take account of geography. This was the subject of my first book, Renaissance Ethnography and the Invention of the Human, New World Maps and Monsters. But let's move now from ecology to the question of animals. She peers out, a folded sheet in her hands, almost as if she's waiting to show us her homework. The vibrant pattern on her dress makes it look like a party frock, a celebration of orange and crimson swipes, swirls, tendrils, and tulips that echo the blooms in her hair. Slashed sleeves show off a rich green fabric underneath the dress, picking up the leaves that garland her head. Antoinette Gonsalves, or Antonietta Gonzalez, born in Paris in the 1580s, was perhaps 8 years old when this watercolor was copied from a recent painting. Someone, not knowing how old Antoinette was, penned the caption, "A 20-year-old woman with a furry head resembling that of an ape, and a smooth, hairless body." Antoinette's portrait appears in the massive repository of drawings and watercolors amassed by the 16th century Bolognese physician, collector, and naturalist Ulisse Aldrovandi. Scroll through the digitized volumes of drawings, and it's difficult not to do a double take at this portrait of little Antoinette, for her face looks decidedly furry. And the picture is in a volume largely devoted to animals. How would this girl in a dress have felt to find herself here? Would there be surprise or knowing? Little Antoinette is unlikely to have found animal comparisons flattering. Her condition, now termed hypertrichosis universalis, is extremely rare. Only about 50 cases are known through surviving documentation. Antoinette was the daughter of the also hairy Petrus Gonsalves, an indigenous person from the Canary Islands in the eastern Atlantic Ocean. In 1547, when Petrus was a boy, he was captured by Spanish invaders and taken to the French royal court. There he was schooled in Latin, the language of the educated, and became a courtier. He married a French woman named Catherine. The couple had 6 children who survived infancy. All but one appear to have been unusually hairy. Petrus Gonsalves lived at a time when ships from Europe were crossing oceans to deposit explorers, colonists, merchants, clerics, physicians, and naturalists on distant shores. Their writings and pictures revealed to Europe numerous baffling species that were new to them. Where did an armadillo go on the map of life, or a bird of paradise said to lack legs and to spend its life in the air, even while sleeping? For some observers, there was much about the wider world that was frightening. In this Portuguese painting, Satan and his demons have New World attributes, like feather costumes and an African hunting horn or oliphant. Some demons cross species and gender categories, and yet some of the sinners whose punishments were believed to match their crimes are being force-fed coins and spices. Renaissance Europeans interpreted the word beyond Europe in myriad ways. Petrus Gonçalves seemed to straddle the boundary between human and animal. Perhaps he was an exception that proved the rule that humans are humans and animals are not. But if he were not entirely human, then human and animal were not entirely separate categories. He had hairy children with a typical woman. What did that say about the boundary between hairy folk and humans? Were human and animal overlapping? Perhaps it was safer to recognize them all as entirely human, just unusually hairy. The Gonsalves family lived much of their lives at European courts and in aristocratic villas and palaces in Paris, Parma, and Rome. The family occupied an overlap between pets, exotic collectibles, and courtiers. On the one hand, they were living the dream. Nobles commissioned their portraits and hung them next to their own, as did Aldrovandi. On the other hand, family members found themselves given away by their employers as gifts, only to have to start their courtly lives anew. And here's the inside of Schloss Ambras's curiosity cabinet with portraits. For elites in Europe, even if all people were people, some people were clearly more people than others. One of the names for the family's condition is Ambras syndrome, after Schloss Ambras, the extraordinary palace complex near Innsbruck in the Austrian Alps. Viewers can still see Antoinette Gonsalves, her brother Henri, and her father Petrus's full-length portraits on the walls of the palace's Wunderkammer, or Cabinet of Curiosities. Here they have hung since the 16th century. They're all depicted at the mouths of caves, a move that undercuts their elegant outfits. On the same wall hang a portrait of a giant and a dwarf, someone with congenital joint problems, a person who was gored through the eye with a lance, but lived, portrayed with said lance in eye, and Vlad III Tepes, or Vlad the Impaler, the inspiration for Bram Stoker's Dracula. In the eyes of the collector Archduke Ferdinand I of Tyrol, dwarfs, giants, hairy people, and disabled individuals went together. The price for bodily difference was to be pushed out of the category of normal. This was not simply a taxonomic and intellectual decision. It was an emotional and psychological one. To understand taxonomy, one must also pay attention to how emotions shape how people define what they mean by normal. Like Renaissance physicians, today's scientists sometimes wrestle with how to classify life forms previously unknown to them. In 2003, on the island of Flores, Indonesia, scientists excavated fossilized bones from people averaging just 1 meter 6 centimeters in height, 3.5 feet. Homo floresiensis, as this species would soon be called, although the nickname of hobbit was perhaps unavoidable, seemed to have become extinct only 17,000 years ago. Now we know it was a bit longer ago. Their presence on Earth had overlapped with that of modern humans, Homo sapiens. So were the Flores fossils those of a late surviving near relative of people living today, the remains of another species of great ape, or merely the bones of a few diseased individuals? Within a few years, the growing consensus that Homo floresiensis was a hominin led scientists to revise the genealogy of Homo sapiens. Such debates are common in paleoanthropology. But while scientists know what a human is in geographical space, they are far less sure what a human is across geological time. In the 11th century, a couple of generations after the Norman conquest of southern Britain, the historian Gerald of Wales had this to say about the English, and I quote, "The English people are the most worthless of all people under heavens. In their own land, the English are slaves of the Normans, the most abject slaves. In our own land, that is the Welsh-English borderlands, there are none but Englishmen in the jobs of ploughman, shepherd, cobbler, skinner, artisan, and cleaner of the sewers." End quote. Gerald was descended from Norman conquerors and Welsh nobility. He cast the English as fundamentally inferior, albeit essential workers. They worked with unpleasant substances, from mud to excrement. Few people today associate race with medieval Britain, yet Gerald essentialized and dehumanized the English in ways that parallel how people define and weaponize race today. Gerald's writing shows how human hierarchy intersected with ideas about nation and national identity. Race was not exclusively or necessarily about physical appearance or ancestry. The English, Normans, and Welsh didn't vary in skin color or hair type to the extent that they would have varied from people living in, say, East Asia or Southern Africa. But Gerald defined the English as fundamentally different and inferior using another characteristic: their jobs. Then, as now, race was about more than skin color. Categories like this are stories that shape laws, institutions, and customs. During the era of Atlantic slavery, European states wrote legal codes called black codes. These laws defined enslaved Africans as property. By writing them, lawmakers invented a particular distinction between enslaved African-descended people and poor white indentured workers. This distinction broke the labor solidarity between white servants and enslaved Africans. Laws like the 1661 Slave and Servant Acts of Barbados invented as legal categories enslaved black Africans and white Christian servants, giving them different rights under the law. Some black codes penalized interracial relationships. These laws defined the children of an enslaved woman as enslaved even if their father was a free white enslaver. Such laws attempted to invent and maintain a boundary between white and black, between free and enslaved, between person and property, by disappearing mixed-race children into the category of the African-descended and enslaved. From the 18th century onwards, science offered even more routes to monster making. In 1735, the Swedish botanist Carl Linnaeus published The System of Nature, a treatise for identifying and naming species. The book detailed a hierarchy of nature from the highest to the lowest orders. And here's a page from the English translation of 1806 from the original Latin. This is a page, the first page of the primates. In the 10th edition you see here, that out of 12 that appeared in Linnaeus' lifetime, humans appeared at the top and were subdivided into African, American, Asian, and European. Linnaeus distinguished these groups by creating stereotypes of their features, behavior, temperament, and organization. See here, African, choleric. These are the terms from the ancient humoral theory. The European was supposedly sanguine, Asians were supposedly melancholy, and Africans were phlegmatic. Remember the ancient humoral system. So that's the top half of the page on Homo. This is Homo sapiens. And the next one, bottom half, each continent also had its own monster type, what Linnaeus called Homo monstrosus. There's that subdivision and the list of types of people: the mountaineer, the Patagonian, the Hottentot, the American, the Chinese, and the Canadian, with various features. Left unanswered was the question of how distinct each of these monstrous peoples were from those around them. Yet, in a book about the taxonomy of nature, in which humans and animals were arranged in tables, the visual rhetoric was one of distinct, unequal beings. As you go through the book, beings become less complex and less like humans. A century later, in The Origin of Species of 1859, Charles Darwin used the term monster for some extinct species and for anomalous individuals brought on by mutation. In the 1869 edition, he added, and I quote, "At long intervals of time, out of millions of individuals, deviations of structure so strongly as to produce, deviations of structure so strongly pronounced as to deserve to be called monstrosities arrives," he wrote. He also referred to mutated members of a species as sports. This was the ancient term for nature's jokes. I want to think now about people who assembled and compared monsters, what you might call monster collectors. The Wellcome Library for the History of Medicine in London contains a striking set of binders of pamphlets, newspaper cuttings, postcards, photographs, and handbills. Each of 5 boxes is in a box. On the spine of each, the cataloguer has summarized the contents with a single disturbing word: freaks. These binders, full of people framed as monsters, reveal dehumanizing classification systems at work. Sometimes these individuals leverage their distinctiveness into a life in show business. They let people gaze for a fee at their unusual bodies, or endured it. Leafing through the binders, I was struck by the familiar London street names and iconic venues at which events once called freak shows had taken place for decades, even centuries. There was the Egyptian Hall in Piccadilly, the site of misadventures in Edith Nesbit's early 20th century children's books. Another locale was 94 Pall Mall, which evokes the Monopoly board game. In 1829 and again in 1869, Chang and Eng Bunker, the original Siamese twins joined at the hip, appeared here. The South African Sarah Baartman was put on display at 225 Piccadilly near Leicester Square, where street performers still draw crowds. Fairs in Europe had centuries-long traditions of performances by foreign or atypically embodied individuals, people who posed or went about their supposedly daily activities. One such fair was Bartholomew Fair in West Smithfield, London. First chartered in 1133, it ran amazingly until 1855. Numerous performers appear in the monster compendium assembled by a certain James Paris Duplessis, manservant to the diarist Samuel Pepys. His mother-in-law had apparently been frightened by a lobster while pregnant when visiting Leadenhall Market, seen here, and given birth to a lobster child. Here are some pages from his compendium. One hailed from Guyana and had been kidnapped at the age of 8 and taken to Virginia. He escaped when the ship arrived at the coast. Later he was captured again and sold in London and showed publicly at the age of 10 in 1690 when Duplessis saw him, and he saw him again in 1725. His show-worthy characteristic appears to have been vitiligo. His body was apparently, I quote, "of a jet black intermixed with a clear and beautiful white, spotted all over," end quote. There was a wild and hairy Irishman. Wildness was a characteristic that tens of thousands of Europeans and later Americans would pay to see in fairs every year. According to ancient authorities, wild individuals were closer to animals than regular ones, a view that reduced the barrier to taking their rights away. They were supposedly childlike, irrational. The charge of wildness had been used against entire peoples. Early English settlers in New England wrote that indigenous peoples were wild, uncultivated, lacking agriculture. In fact, these people did tend to and live in dynamic relationships with plants, animals, and the land. Their activities were merely invisible to the English, who were looking for monocultural crop plantings. Du Plessis also wrote of a monstrous Tartar, said to have been captured in Hungary in 1664. This person had, I quote, spent all his arrows in fight against the Christians, end quote. This invented narrative about a crack horseman reframes the Tartar's terrific archery skills and horsemanship as the acts of a human-horse hybrid, as if he truly were a centaur. Centuries before Charles Darwin's Origin of Species and the debate over a potential missing link between humans and apes, people were drawn to fairs and shows to marvel at mysterious instances where human and animals seemed to collapse in on each other. Sometimes fairground advertisements crush together a bewildering range of human performers come prisoners. Mr. Smith's exhibition, a bargain at just 1 penny, boasted, and I quote, the Norfolk giant, Tom Thumb, the celebrated dwarf, a two-headed child, and the African lady in her native costume. Continuing with the quote, this beautiful creature, in addition to possessing exquisite beauty and elegance of form and feature, speaks all the ancient and modern languages with the greatest ease and facility, end quote. In Mr. Smith's telling, the edge of humanity was a place of both atypical births and prodigious excellence. And you might remember here, Schloss Ambras as well. And there were exclusive ways to peer at those with unusual bodies. Wealthy people could pay performers to entertain them and their select friends in the privacy of their homes. Scholars and physicians also attended such exhibitions. These included the 17th century gardening expert John Evelyn, microscopist Robert Hooke, and the diarist Samuel Pepys, the employer of the man who assembled this manuscript, with many more pages. The reason some of these images are from microfilm is that I tried to order images 2 days after the British Library suffered a cyber attack from which it is still recovering. So people like Evelyn and Hooke and Pepys were all members of the Royal Society, London's first scientific society. Journals and meeting minutes revealed practitioners of anatomy, ethnology, and medicine viewing and examining bearded ladies, individuals with unusual skin pigmentation, and people from overseas. In a sense, the society reframed certain individuals whom enslavers and impresarios marketed as freaks as crossover acts, at once entertainment for the masses and respectable and pedagogical, even the stuff of new discovery. For a showman, the Royal Society's interest in anyone classed as a monster was marketable. 19th century monster making in fairs brought Darwinian ideas to the general public. Audiences flocked to see kidnapped indigenous people from Asia, Africa, and the Americas in human zoos or freak shows, where atypically embodied or disabled people were also treated as spectacles. In some cases, these people were called the missing link between humans and apes, or as one pamphlet put it, living proof of Darwin's theory of the descent of man. At the height of European imperial dominance in the 19th and early 20th centuries, peoples from Tierra del Fuego, Sub-Saharan Africa, Australia, and similarly distant corners of Europe's empires were transported to cities like London and Paris and forced to perform their lives on public display at exhibitions and fairs. The language of their exhibitors made clear that they viewed these people as the lowest rung of humanity, as almost bestial, incapable of receiving God's grace. So to the final part of my talk. My working definition of monster has been category disruptor. Let's turn to the emotional charge of those monsters that we don't like. Sometimes the initial response to a monster is what the German psychiatrist Ernst Jentz called unheimlich, or uncanny, a twilight zone between ordinary and creepy. In 1970, the Japanese roboticist Masahiro Mori surmised that an artificial being that closely resembled a human but was not quite identical to one would generate far less empathy and feelings of comfort than one that was obviously a mechanical object. And he plotted different kinds of human-made, vaguely human-like objects on this graph. So here you see human likeness plotted on the horizontal axis of this graph against affinity or feeling comfortable on the vertical axis for various beings. A robot, stuffed animal, artificial hands, a corpse, a zombie, dolls, puppets, and even an ill person. Or rather, actually here we have a healthy person. Mori found that human viewers felt greater affinity as likeness increased. You can see the slope of the graph going up as you go to the right, but only up to a point. His subjects felt most weirded out by beings that were very close to but not entirely like a healthy person. A prosthetic hand, relatively similar to a human hand, was uncanny, but a toy robot, much less similar, was relatively pleasing. If the entity was moving, the difference in feeling was much greater. And so you can see here a zombie was terrifying, but an ordinary doll prompted mildly positive feelings. Mori called this affinity trough or dip on the right-hand side, near the middle, the uncanny valley, or the zone of uncertainty and weirdness. Mori's research suggested that the category of what one might call feels like a person, or beings towards whom one feels empathy, doesn't entirely map onto looks like a human. A viewer's emotions determine what feels like a person is to them, just like how feels like a monster is an emotional category. Both reactions reveal not a monster, but a feeling. Uncanny beings imply that there's a continuum from ill, alive people to puppets and even zombies. On this continuum are cyborgs, amalgams of humans and machines. In 1960, scientists Manfred Clynes and Nathan Klein published a paper in the journal Astronautics that suggested that dissolving this boundary entirely was a way to solve some of the challenges of human spaceflight. And this is one of the gems I found in the Linda Hall Library. Clynes and Klein proposed devising superhuman cybernetic organisms for whom they coined the term cyborgs. Their physiology would be regulated by drugs and mechanical implants that enable them to survive in environments different from Earth. Such an astronaut might, for example, have an artificial lung that removes the need to breathe, or be injected with drugs to place them in hibernation. Cyborg astronauts remain theoretical, but they have inspired countless fictional scenarios that invite us to wonder whether the boundary between human and monster is porous. My favourite cyborgs are the Borg collective in Star Trek Next Generation, which I heartily recommend. With their deathly pallor, prosthetics, hive mind, and drones like mechanized zombies, The Borg's original form is a masterclass in how to craft a perfect screen monster. For all their creepy appearance and juggernaut-like technology, the ultimate terror they pose is that they monstrify those whom they assimilate. Us. And you see Captain Jean-Luc Picard straight after assimilation right in the centre there, with Borg on either side. The Borg Collective is a bunch of beings, bipedal composite species whose sinister greenish cubic ships troll the galaxy. When they counter species with distinctive knowledge and technology, they assimilate them. They inject each member of an assimilated species with microscopic robotic devices which transfigure them from inside and implant them with cybernetic parts. These parts allow instant communication across the entire Borg Collective and give the new drones extraordinary strength and built-in armaments. An arm extended with a prosthetic has tools on the end. An oculus implant sits on a biological eye. In the wake of a Borg visitation, a species is blended into a collective, leaving nothing behind. This is not just a worst-case scenario for an alien first contact situation. It's also an unsettling parallel for what societies lose once efficiency, defined too narrowly, runs amok. The Best of Both Worlds double episode prepares the ground for the Borg as an unprecedented threat by activating everything the viewer knows about both the Star Trek universe and iconic monster archetypes like zombies and Frankenstein's monster. Their distinctive features trigger deep-seated fears about the boundary or lack thereof between human and machine. They don't eat food, they plug themselves into power sources. Their bodies turn that into nutrients. Every drone can hear the thoughts of every other Borg drone. The collective's assimilation tactics are especially unsettling now. Viewers notice the path from the everyday world of yesterday's democracy to the coercive, dystopian surveillance state of the Borg and, increasingly, the present. The universal question here is, what does it take to defeat a monstrous foe who is also, in some ways, you? We now seem to be heading in the opposite direction to the utopian vision of Star Trek. Far from enjoying the end of hunger and war, hundreds of millions live in war zones, financial precarity, and hunger, while billionaires amass more wealth than they could spend in a millennium. Instead of having the time and resources to reach their potential, most people and their minds, bodies, and intellectual property are, to giant corporations, little more than extractive resources, their needs viewed as an inconvenience to corporate profits. If humanity is to survive the current moment of monstrification, a good place to start would be to step away from turning into the Borg. If I had another hour and some coffee, I could talk about zombies and shapeshifters, witches, Shakespeare's Tempest and The Muppet Show. But I have neither time nor coffee, so I'll leave you to read the book. I also have some excerpts and spin-off essays you can find by going to my website. In some ways, yesterday's monsters are no longer monsters. Audiences in the West no longer flock to see kidnapped indigenous people in zoos or to events called freak shows. But monstrification continues. Immigrants and refugees face dehumanizing treatment, even terrorism. Women athletes who fail to meet someone's conventions for what a woman should look like face accusations that they aren't really women. Trans people and black people are regularly treated by the Western press, public, police, and politicians like they pose as types uniquely dangerous threats. Today's monster making may not include the word monster as often as it used to, but that just makes the practice of monstrification more insidious. Resisting the rhetoric involves being mindful of three things. First, recognizing monstrification for what it is, a process that constrains, even endangers people's lives for no other reason than that they give the lie to myths about tidy, unchanging categories. Second, it involves understanding that there are hidden agendas when people spin stories to declare that some people deserve fewer rights or don't deserve due process. Anyone pushing a monstrifying agenda is using historical patterns of prejudice and fear to activate the worst versions of society for their own gain. Finally, almost no one is safe in a culture of monstrification. Since no social category is hermetically sealed from the others, the risk of becoming the object of monstrification is contagious. Either everyone's rights are protected or no one can be sure their own rights will be upheld. So how should we think about monsters? What might a better future be like? In an essay about the blurry boundary between humans and technology published in 1985, the biologist and historian of science Donna Haraway made, I quote, an argument for pleasure in the confusion of boundaries and for responsibility in their construction, end quote. We can extend this thought beyond the human-machine boundary to all boundaries at the edge of the human and between social categories. Rather than fearing squishy boundaries between ourselves, however defined, and others, we might celebrate the wonder of possibility, a mode of thinking I call monstro-futurism. I'm inspired by the creative, empowering fiction of Afrofuturism, which transcends the legacies of slavery. With monstro-futurism, I propose a monster-centered ethics, one that accepts, welcomes, and celebrates human variety, instead of insisting that we all live in fixed, discrete boxes. Human difference doesn't have to be mapped onto a hierarchy that recognizes some people as more people than others. A better future would be one in which people's sense of self wasn't pinned to fixed ideas about what they or their people were, in which difference and change expanded our collective choices and possibilities. In this world, we would all be wondrous monsters, but not monstrous. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Dr. Davis. That was wonderful. And again, the book is Humans, A Monstrous History. Get your copy now. It's available at your local bookseller. And if you have a question for Surekha, type them in the Q&A chat box you see at the bottom of your screen. You can also, I see some people posting some questions in chat. So let's begin with a question for John. John, thank you for tuning in tonight. And he asks, in your view, to what extent were early modern dehumanizing narratives simple bigotry, and to what degree do you think they may have represented intentional efforts to justify oppression?
Well, what we see in the documentation is various stories being told to draw boundaries between groups where there was a continuum, or to justify some groups having fewer rights. Ultimately, the end game of bigotry is to reduce people's rights. But then which group are you going to do that to? If you have, people existing on a continuum, the early modern world was a time of mass movement of Europeans within Europe, tens of thousands of religious refugees fleeing the Reformation, when Catholicism broke into lots of factions and Protestantism emerged. Stories were told about how, groups were entitled to fewer rights, and laws were written in. You couldn't practice, Protestantism in some kingdoms, you couldn't practice Catholicism in others, or you could only do it in private. In the Spanish Empire, there were periods when if you were descended from anyone Jewish or Muslim, even if you had converted to Catholicism, you weren't allowed to move to the Americas for fear you would interfere with attempts to proselytize. So I suppose, I guess bigotry is a kind of storytelling, and it can find its way into the legal mechanism. But to do that, you have to draw boundaries between the people who get the rights and the people who don't. And that involves kind of walling out anybody who shows that actually people live on a continuum.
That's great. Elizabeth comments in chat that she missed the first part. Elizabeth, sorry you missed that, but yes, the recording of tonight's presentation will be available on the Linda Hall Library's YouTube channel. And all right, Stephen asked a question. Since our definitions of monsters, as well as the fiction genre of horror, is informed by societal anxieties and bias, what do you predict will be the next trend to rise? A future emphasis on machine/AI or something else entirely?
Um, there is certainly a kind of increasing, concern about kind of what human means in
Sure.
an age with more and more, machines that are supposedly capable of doing what we can do. And I think we are, definitely being thrown out of the airlock where a lot of corporations are concerned. For example, what does it mean to kind of encourage people to not make things out of their own mind, their own, write their own letters, experiment with the possibility of making art or kind of music, but rather to press a button and appropriate things that have been uploaded into large language models, for example. So the very idea of intellectual property, which is currently, under threat, and also your own right to your own, your image, your own likeness. Those are stories being told, which are kind of innately about what a human is and what you're allowed to do to a human. So I would say that kind of everyone is really being thrown out of an airlock, and that's also not terribly new. I mean, kind of labor rights are stories about the condition of humanity. Before there were, weekends or minimum wages. Those are other kinds of stories about who matters. And our right to our own, data and creations are very much being taken away. I mean, initially by a certain amount of stealth, all of those technologies we use, which are stealthily turning on we're going to steal your content unless you find your way to the preferences where you can turn
Right.
them off.
Right. Brian writes, great presentation. I like how you go back centuries and then conclude with Star Trek and cyborgs. It's
Thank
a
you.
wide swath of history. And my colleague could keep right there. Eric has a question. He comments, wonderful presentations. Thank you. And his question is, how do we distinguish between loving monsters, monstro-futurism, and the kind of, and being slightly anachronistic, tokenism or exceptionalism that allowed some African descended people to be exceptional?
Um, I suppose the way to avoid tokenism is to recognize the structural barriers that exist and remove them. And I mean, the kind of hugest, the biggest structural inequality is an income inequality, and that falls disproportionately on people of color in the Western world. So fixing those things matters, investing in education,
Sure.
but also recognizing that we swim in a space of intense prejudice. It's just kind of vats of it that go back a millennia.
All right. I just lost that question. Uh, do you draw a distinction between monsterification and dehumanization, as in the historical use of terms like vermin, parasites, snakes, etc.?
Great question. before you can dehumanize, you have to categorize where the okay people end and the ones you're going to dehumanize begins. And so that's the line I'm looking at. And perhaps a kind of powerful example is the way the black codes of the kind of colonial slaving empires told stories about mixed race children. Because the moment you have mixed race children with an enslaved black mother and a white father, well, what are they? Are they black or white? Are they enslaved or free? And the continuum that is the kind of human condition makes it, difficult to say, well, there's a binary. So
Right.
then what? So how do you dehumanize? Where does the dehumanization end? So by deciding that to punish anyone who has a mixed race child, you're trying to disappear them, and only then can you dehumanize effectively because you create a border, almost like a demilitarized zone between the ones whom you're going to call vermin and the ones you aren't. But in practice, what happens is these kinds of activities, they're contagious and more people become called illegitimate. And we see this in Nazi Germany as well. It started as, if you have 1/8 of Jewish ancestry, that was a problem. And getting this the right way around. But little by little, more and more people fell into categories who were going to be rounded up, and some of them included, political protesters.
All right. Bram Stoker's Dracula was inspired by cholera, the New England vampire panic in the 1800s linked to tuberculosis. Do you think the possibility of contagion is inversely related to evoked empathy, which is why a zombie falls in the uncanny valley, but an ill person does not? Also, what do you think of the recent trend of positive portrayal of monsters in fiction lately?
Ha. I'll start with the second part of that because my book was quoted in the New Yorker in the review of the new Frankenstein movie, and that review was about how monsters have suddenly all become cuddly. So I would say that the idea of monsters being positive as opposed to negative, goes back to ancient times where monsters simply meant category breaker, and then you had to decide when you saw one whether it was, a divine sign, that you're all going to hell, or simply a joke or an accident. And in the Middle Ages, the kind of key emotion around strange things was wonder. So, and I guess that's why I work on this at all. It's a childhood spent watching Star Trek and watching, the Enterprise and the Deep Space Nine crew have these, encounters of wonder. I mean, the next generation especially. And then you decide or experience whether this group is a threat or not. As to the kind of contagion, that fear of some kind of contagion is definitely what makes monstrification a different thing from simply prejudice or bigotry. And kind of when people monstrify others, they're not just saying, well, they're horrible for X, Y, Z reason. They fear that their own self is no longer going to be stable because these other people exist. So that's a particular threat that, say, and I don't know, say, an immigrant Iranian poses that an Iranian just over there living in Iran doesn't. So if you
Right.
monsters are also kind of those kind of that negative monstrification is about attempts to tell stories that allow you to imagine yourself, your gender, your nation, whatever, as being unchangeable when, in fact, there have been, swathes of people moving around Europe and back and forth and throughout the world, forever.
Will we ever get to a place where I think you called it the monster centered ethics? Is that possible, you think?
I hope so. It
We're
involves
gonna end. We're at the top of the hour. Maybe end on a little hope there.
I hope so. And this is where, science fiction and speculative fiction are ways in which people are kind of thinking through alternative scenarios for a future. And things often do get better, even if they do slide backwards here and there on occasion. So we
It
do
it
we do have
take
a
it
future.
sometimes it takes a long time, but yeah, it's true. They do get better. Two steps
Indeed.
forward, one step back, and here we are. So, well, Professor Dr. Davies, thank you so much for just a wonderful presentation. Congratulations on the book. I've enjoyed
Thank you.
reading it, and really appreciate you taking the time to talk about your work tonight, especially to get up in the middle of the night
Well, it's a
to.
very appropriately monstrous time, isn't it?
That's right. That's right. But certainly our U.S. audience really appreciates it, and I know I did. So, thank you again.
Thanks so much for having me.